Hello. I hope everyone can hear me. I do want to preface this workshop and say that I'm recording. So thank you for the thumbs up that you can hear me, Jen. So if you don't want to be recorded, I would just, I guess, say leave, although I would love for you to stay. I'm simply recording so that I can share the workshop with those who are unable to attend. So if you have any I guess, feelings of uncomfortableness around being recorded, now is your cue to step out of the room. Okay, so I want to go ahead and just jump right in. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. John can hear me. That's great. If you have questions, John, since your mic's not working, you can go ahead and drop them in the chat. I will be answering questions at the end, so hang on to them, write them down if you can. But I do want to go ahead and just jump right in so we can give you all plenty of time to ask questions at the end. So welcome to Planning to Perform. So I designed this workshop, as you may probably already know, to help you take a year-round approach to your training so that you can perform at your best. So let's jump on in. If you drop anything in the chat, keep in mind I cannot read it right now. I will get to it after the presentation. So we're going to spend the first half of this workshop digesting some information, and then we'll save the last half for your questions. So a little bit about me for those of you who don't already know. My name's Christy. I'm a climber. I'm also a yoga instructor and a strength and conditioning specialist. My mission is to help climbers like you get super strong, technically poised, and mentally confident so that you can feel empowered to truly take your climbing anywhere, whether that be to the New River Gorge here or to your climbing gym down the road. So I want to start by sharing a little bit about my strength training journey. So although I am a personal trainer and a strength and conditioning specialist, I actually didn't start strength training until a couple years ago in 2019. But before that, I really just climbed. And I paid very little attention to what time of the year it was, or didn't really plan out my year per se. I just wanted to climb and perform at my best year round. However, it got cruxy when I moved to Fayetteville, West Virginia. Obviously, I came here for the climbing in the New River Gorge, but for those of you who know, we don't actually have access to a climbing gym. So although we do have year-round access to outdoor climbing, you're constantly battling the weather. And if you know, it rains here a lot. So having to work around the weather, I found that essentially I had plateaued for a really long time. I would have basically spent all of the good weather months trying to push my grade, take my climbing to the next level. And then the weather would go to crap and I would find myself starting over at square one. So having to constantly work around the weather, I decided that it would be best if I just focused on some strength training and finger training instead during those crappy weather months. And that way I would feel a little bit more prepared to start climbing and performing at my best when the season allowed for it. So hence the year-round approach. So in this workshop, we're going to talk a little bit about foundational strength training, and then we're going to dive into what the difference is between our off-season training, pre-season training, and in-season training. I will say that I am going to put a heavy emphasis on strength training when we talk about each of these, but we will touch a little bit on what your climbing training will look like during those times of the year. Finally, we're going to wrap it up with kind of a step-by-step approach to help you plan out your year and some tips for success. And then, of course, at the end, the Q&A. So a year-round approach, what exactly is that? What I refer to as a year-round approach, others actually might understand a little bit better as periodization. So it's simply planning to focus one's training efforts more heavily on certain facets of our fitness than others during specific times of the year. So it's planning your training around when you want to perform. So let's first all agree that climbing is really, really hard to train for because it requires us to have high levels of aerobic, anaerobic endurance, strength, power, and stamina, basically all at the same time. So, not to mention that, but you also need a fair amount of technique and tactics if you want to perform at your best. But of course, who has time to train all of these things? If you have time to train all of these things, I applaud you because personally, I think that no one has time for all of this. So, there are two things that I have personally come to accept over the years, and I really wish I could just drill it into the brains of every other climber that I meet. And those two are first, you can't do all of the things all of the time. The second is that you can't expect to perform at your absolute best all of the time either. So once we can accept these two things, we can actually start to make a plan to perform. So taking a step back for a second, I want to just define some terms here. So the first is strength. What do I mean when I say strength? I mean it is your ability to exert force. Power, on the other hand, is your ability to exert force explosively or quickly. Endurance is your strength displayed over time. And what's funny about all of these is that strength is actually at the foundation of all of these adaptations. So, as climbers, we often hear people focused on improving their power and improving their endurance. But what they fail to recognize is that actually strength is at the foundation of all of these adaptations. So, another thing that you all must know about if you're going to plan out your year effectively is a fancy little term called adaptation persistence. So, persistence is how long a given facet of training takes to build and how long it takes to go away. So, adaptations that we like to talk about often are strength, power, and endurance. What's cool about our strength is that it is hard to gain, but it's also pretty hard to lose. So once you spend your time building it up, as long as you maintain it, it'll stick around for a really long time. Similarly, with power, although power is a little bit quicker to lose, however, endurance, the one everybody loves, is actually really easy to gain and easy to lose. So, understanding how adaptation persistence can works can help you understand the importance of training your strength year round, but it can also help you to make decisions around when to focus on which of these adaptations. Like I said, it's really hard to do all of the things all of the time. So knowing that if you sacrifice, say, your endurance training for a moment, you also know that it'll come back really quickly once you pick it back up. So, foundational strength, what exactly is it? It is the baseline strength that you have upon which everything else is built. So, a great analogy is it is your foundation of your house. Like, you cannot build a solid, beautiful house if you do not have a good foundation. If your foundation is crap, so is basically the rest of the house. So why should we focus on it year round? Well, other than the fact that it is foundational, like I said, strength takes a really, really long time to build. So if you have a solid foundation of strength, then because it's the foundation, you're able to generate more power. You can build fitness a lot easier, and your endurance is actually quite good. So you're able to endure a lot more. All right, so when we're talking about the year-round approach, as I mentioned, some people refer to this as periodization. So we're going to talk about the two types of periodization that you'll often see plastered all over the internet in terms of climbing training. So the first is linear periodization. For linear periodization program, you will typically focus on one training adaptation at a time. So you're either going to focus on strength for a couple weeks, power for a couple weeks, and endurance for another couple weeks. If you are familiar with the Rock Climbers Training Manual by the Anderson brothers, they use a linear periodization approach to planning out their training. So typically it'll include a gradual progression of slowly increasing intensity over time while decreasing the volume. And a typical training block might last anywhere between 4 and 6 weeks. So in a non-linear periodization program, these are becoming a little bit more popular, I'd say. You'll focus on multiple training adaptations at a time. So you can think about it as all in the same week, you're training strength, power, and endurance. Typically speaking, each training adaptation is going to be given equal weight. So you'll spend just as much time strength training as your power training, as your endurance training, but it doesn't always have to be that way. You can assign different weights to different adaptations as they meet the needs of your goals per se, but we'll talk more about that later. So a typical training block can be anywhere between 1 and 4 weeks. Do keep in mind that many coaches will use a combination of both of these, depending on their training philosophy and what works best for each individual. I will say that these bullet points here are very oversimplified when it comes to understanding the differences between both types of periodization. So if you are interested in learning more about these, just shoot me an email. I'll send you some resources, but a quick Google search will also be helpful. All right, so linear periodization, again, we're focusing on one adaptation at a time. Let's talk about the pros and cons. First, let's look at this example. So as you can see, for 6 weeks, you would say focus on strength solely. For maybe the next 4 weeks or so, you might focus on just power, and then power endurance, followed by a rest period, and then insert your performance in season phase. That's when you're focusing on sending your project. So some great things about this linear periodization approach is that it works really, really well for beginners, or anyone with a relatively low training age. It's also really great if you have just one goal in mind that you're working towards. It's also great because it actually allows you to make way more gains at a time. So just by focusing on strength for 6 weeks, you can improve a lot more in that period of time than if you had, say, focused on strength and endurance or strength and power at the same time. It's also great if you want to address a specific weakness of yours. And then finally, the cons are that, well, if you're focusing on training one thing, then certainly something else is going to suffer. All right, so the non-linear periodization, right? We're focusing on multiple training adaptations at a time. So as I mentioned, typically speaking, you will focus on each equally. And that's what's known as a concurrent periodization approach. So you're spending an equal amount of time training strength, power, and endurance. However, what's known as the conjugate periodization approach, that is when you will still train all of the adaptations. However, you will assign different weight to each. So, for example, say you know that you are extremely lacking in some kind of strength, so you're focused on building strength. You might choose to say strength train twice a week and train endurance once and power another day. So you're still training all 3 adaptations, but you're focusing more heavily on your strength training. So here's just an example of what a week might look like. As you can see here, you have strength training, power endurance, long duration endurance, and power training. So this example, it is a conjugate periodization approach, but you're focused more heavily on endurance. Given what we know about endurance training and adaptation persistence, I would say looking at this example, that might be an approach that you might choose to take when you are getting really close to your performance phase, or maybe at the end of a preseason phase. So some pros, it allows you to train basically everything at once, keeps things exciting and interesting, and it can be really great for intermediate and advanced athletes who can tolerate a bit more training load. And then the cons, it's quite challenging to develop all the adaptations equally using a concurrent periodization program. And it also might not be enough training volume of each to really get the gains that you're looking for. So for example, how it might be challenging to develop all three adaptations, say at once. Say in your example week here, right? Maybe your strength and power training day might be a limit bouldering session, right? But your power endurance training day might also be another bouldering day. So as you can see, let's say you backed these up, like you didn't have a rest day in between them, your performance might suffer a little bit on the power endurance day because, say, you're going into that session a little bit more fatigued because you had bouldered the day before. So which one will we choose? Are we going to go with the linear approach or the nonlinear approach? And I would say that it doesn't have to be so black and white like that. Depending on your goals, you might cycle through different types of periodization during different times of the year. For example, right now, personally, I'm heavily focused on strength, and that is the only thing that I'm doing. So you might say that I'm taking a more linear approach. However, as I get closer to the performance time of the year, and so in the New River Gorge, for the spring season, I would say that's about May. So as I get closer to May, I'm going to shift to taking more of a conjugate non-linear style of periodization when it comes to my training. So I'm going to focus on a little bit of everything, but I'll emphasize the specific adaptations that I feel I need to focus on as we get closer to that time of the year. So here's an example of just how I'm personally planning my next few months in terms of training. Keep in mind that what I'm doing for training, how I lay out my year is going to look different than how you choose to lay out yours. But as you can see, January and February, those are those off-season months. I'm spending a little bit less time climbing. This month, I'm going to focus heavily on building strength. That will be the only adaptation that I focus on. And then come February, I'm going to still keep strength in the mix, but put a little bit more of a heavy focus on power. And then come March, as I get closer to May, which is my performance time of the year, I'm going to want to start focusing a little bit more on endurance. But keep in mind, in March, I will still be strength training and I will still be power training. It's just going to take the back seat while I focus on endurance. And then come April, I'm going to focus on each adaptation about equally. And then the same thing for May. So what's important to note here is that strength I will be doing all year round. So with that said, let's talk about strength training and how it'll differ during these different times of the year. So your off season, that's usually the time after the season, like your sending season, but it could also be, say, the furthest time away from when you would like to perform. Typically, an off season lasts about 4 to 8 weeks. And during this time, your main goal is to focus on functional movement and strength development, putting your climbing or any sport-specific skill work on the back burner. So by intentionally shifting your focus away from climbing to build foundational strength, you'll support the development of your sport-specific skills later down the line. And you're probably thinking, well, what about climbing? Hello, I am here to rock climb. Yes, you can still rock climb during the off season. However, your climbing sessions might be more strength focused. So say if you were sticking to a linear plan, or you might focus on lower intensity climbing sessions, say movement drills, technique, or endurance training if you were taking a non-linear approach. But again, the focus is still strength. So as I've noted over here, you might strength train 3 times per week and then focus on climbing 2 times per week. As far as strength training goes, I like to choose 4 to 8 exercises and do a fair amount of volume. So anywhere between 3 and 5 sets. Your training age is going to dictate how much volume exactly you will need to get those strength adaptations. But when you are writing a training program for yourself, try to focus on compound lifts and choose at least 1, if not 2, from each of the 4 movement patterns. So those movement patterns, I posted about this recently on Instagram, but they are push, pull, squat, and hinge. This allows us to make sure we cover all of our bases and all of our big muscle groups. So here's an example of some exercises that you might choose to include in your off-season training program. All right, so as an example of how you might structure that training session, I like to stick with 3 sets to start, and if I'm seeing progress there, I'll stick with it. If you notice that 3 sets is not enough volume for you, you might up it to 4 or maybe 5. But typically speaking, we're going to operate in that 6 to 8 rep range and stay at around RP 8. If this is like your first week strength training ever, I always recommend starting at like an RP 7 and then slowly building up in intensity. All right, preseason training, as we have already determined, those are the months right before your performance phase, typically anywhere between 4 and 8 weeks. So if you're going to go on a climbing trip in May and you want to send your next hardest sport climb or boulder, then your preseason is going to be the 8 weeks leading up to your trip. During this time, your focus is going to shift a little bit away from that foundational strength training to focusing on more sport-specific strength training, power development, and a focus on improving your tactical and technical skills. So if you are not climbing by this time, you better start freaking climbing because the season is approaching rapidly. So you might spend 2 times a week now strength training and maybe 3 times a week climbing. As for those strength training sessions, I like to pick again 4 to 6 exercises and stick to 3 to 4 sets. So it's a little bit less volume than what you might have previously been doing, but it's not uncommon that the training volume looks about the same. So again, we're still prioritizing those compound lifts. However, you might choose to now sub out, say, your more basic foundational movements for more sport specific movements. So for example, if you were focusing on a split squat variation during your off season, you might switch that out for a step up variation, say like a step up to a box or a bench, to focus on building some more specific strength for those new river high steps. Alternatively, you might switch out some of your exercises to focus on more power development by focusing on velocity-based movements. So instead of your typical barbell back squat, now we're going to focus on maybe a jump squat variation. So just to see how those sessions might look, as you can see, this session is heavily focused on strength. So I have increased the intensity a little bit by lowering the amount of volume and the reps here. Got a little bit more specific by adding in that step up to the box. And then here I've combined some power with some strength training in that second day. So I'm focusing on velocity-based movements for my box jumps, my power push-ups, and keeping in some strength training for that bent over row. All right, so in season, that's the time everyone's psyched for. It's time to perform. And that is exactly what you should be focused on. However, I will say that if you were doing some kind of strength training leading up to your performance phase, then your in season strength training is going to look very similar. However, you will most certainly be doing way less. So fewer exercises, lower volume, so less reps, less number of sets, and you want to keep your target intensity or RPE high. Keeping that RPE and that intensity high is going to allow you to maintain all of that strength that you've worked so hard to build. So now, as you can see, you might strength train maybe even only once or twice a week, and you're still climbing about 3 times per week. So during this performance phase, stick with your 4 to 6 exercises. Make sure they're easy to overload. Lower the reps, so 4 to 6 reps, and maybe only 1 or 2 sets. Make sure that RPE stays high, so RPE 8 or 9. Here's an example of what that strength training session might look like. So as you can see, it's basically the same as it was before. I've just lowered the number of sets and decreased the number of reps. All right. Screenshot this because it's going to come in handy for you later. This is just a recap of what the differences are between the off pre-season that I misspelled and the in season that I also misspelled. And then right here, this in the like purple font, that's just the time of the year that I find personally works best for off season or preseason or in season training if your local home crag is the New River Gorge. So if you're trying to send something this, say spring or May and June, then you want to start thinking about your off-season training now and maybe continue to train through early March. All right. So now that you have all of that information, hopefully it's digesting, let's put it all together. Let's actually start planning out our year. All right, so here is a step-by-step approach to making a plan to perform. The first step, as always, we want to start with our goals. So really think about what it is that you want to accomplish and when exactly do you want to achieve it. The more specific you can make your goals, the better. So as an example, say my goal was to climb slash and burn a 512D, and I want to do this by the end of June. So by the end of this spring season. Second step, consider what you need or you want to focus on so that you can feel the most prepared during that performance phase that you have chosen. So ask yourself, what is standing in the way between you and your goals right now? Is there anything that you would like to focus on that's going to set you up for success when the time comes? And if you are thinking like, oh my gosh, I just need to focus on everything, just rank them in order of importance or in order of most helpful. And then keep in mind that adaptation persistence when you are ranking things. So remember that you can't train everything all of the time, and understanding how adaptation persistence works might help you rank those a little bit differently. All right, and then step 3, you're going to want to work backwards from your goal or when you would like to achieve said goal, or what we call the season, and start drafting a plan. So really be realistic with yourself. How much time can you spend training? And how much time do you think that you need to get the adaptations that you're looking for? Always keep in mind your end goal, what it is that you are trying to accomplish, and don't be afraid to make sacrifices. Remember to focus on one thing, something else definitely has to take the back seat. So for example, personal story, I would say I have probably cycled through so many cycles by now that I know that it really only takes me about 2 to 4 weeks to get my quote unquote endurance back on the wall. And so I know that I need to start my endurance training at least 4 weeks ahead of time. Similarly, I know that it takes me probably 8, if not 12 weeks to get my mind and my head game on point. So I'm definitely going to want to make sure if I have sport goals that I am getting on the sharp end sooner than later. So once you know yourself and you know how long it takes for you to get to where you want to be, you can factor that into your plan. So here's your little recap. Step 1, focus on your goals. Step 2, ask what do you need to focus on? What's going to make you feel good when you enter into that performance time of the year? And then work backwards from there, coming up with your plan. All right, so a couple quick tips for success. Of course, the earlier you can start planning, the better. Narrow your focus when you can. So get really, really specific when you're choosing a goal, or even if you're just choosing what to train, the more specific you can be, the better. Use your training tools for what they are actually designed for. So I put this example here of the fingerboard. Typically the fingerboard, although we can use it, yes, to train endurance, we can use it to train contact strength or even power. But the hangboard is primarily used to build finger strength. So making sure that you're focusing on the tool and the goal that the tool is designed for will also help you to narrow your focus a little bit more. Also remember that plans aren't set in stone. So if you come up with a plan, it can change and it can adapt. Finally, of course, I'm biased when I say this, but work with a coach if you need additional guidance or support. I also want to throw in a quick pitch for my one-on-one coaching intensives because they are great for this. So if you're somebody who likes to come up with your own training plans and you just need some insight to make sure you're on the right path, these one-on-one coaching intensives can be really, really beneficial for that. All right, and then finally, I want to leave you with this last tip. An old friend of mine used to say when I was climbing, when you're climbing, you're climbing. And when you're resting, you're resting. I used to hang on the rope and just like touch all the holds and like pull on and pull into the moves and whatnot. And he said, look, you're resting, so rest, right? And the same goes for training and performance. So when you are training, remember that you're training. That's your focus and that's your intention. And when you are performing, you're performing. So don't expect that during a training phase, you're going to perform at your tip-top shape 100% of the time. But when it's time to perform, you better be focused on performing. Don't be afraid to drop the training if that's what it means. All right, so here's the real pitch. I'm here to tell you about my new strength training program, Simply Strong. It's an 8-week strength and finger training program designed to help you build that solid foundation of strength to support your climbing performance. What makes this program so unique is that unlike other foundational strength training programs, you get a one-on-one support with me as your coach the entire way. So that looks like one-on-one messenger support, unlimited video analysis and feedback, and weekly check-ins. If you are a client who is working with me right now, you know that I am on you and I am keeping you accountable 100% of the way. So by the end of this 8-week program, which launches next week, you will feel stronger than ever before. You'll feel physically prepared to take your climbing to that next level without injury, hopefully. You'll climb more confident and with ease, and you will also have a basic understanding of strength training principles and concepts that you need to really take your training into your own hands moving forward. So what exactly is included in this program? It's weekly strength and finger training sessions. You'll get access to your program via the True Coach app, one-on-one messenger support from me, unlimited video analysis and feedback, and also lifetime access to my newest ebook. It's called The Strength Training Basics with over 80 pages of information. I seriously packed this full. But of course, there's more. I'm going to be launching this program this upcoming week, but if you choose to sign up before this upcoming Friday, January 20th, then you will also get a free 60-minute coaching intensive, or what I'm calling a strategy session. So you'll get an opportunity to meet with me, get your questions answered, whatever they may be, chat about your goals, and more specifically, we can talk about climbing and develop a plan for your climbing training to help you move forward. After the call, everyone will get a copy of your intensive notes from our session, along with some suggestions on how you can move forward. So that's it. Now we can move to the Q&A. If you don't already have my contact info, it is there. I know that you definitely have my email address. So I'll go ahead and close the screen share, drop back into the Zoom room, and open it up for questions. Let's see, we have some already in the chat. I'll start with those. And then if there are no further questions, I did also want to talk a little bit about how you might structure your training if you have other hobbies that require you to be physically active, because I know as climbers, many of us do more than just climb. All right, so from Ozzy, local bouldering spot has really good weather until March, then it gets unbearable, but higher elevation sport crags get in really good conditions as soon as March. How do you split seasons in when focusing on bouldering and then immediately sport? That's a really good question. And actually I do this basically every winter transition to spring. The same holds true for the Newberg Gorge. I honestly think that March is the best time to boulder in the new. And so then comes April and May, which you want to be focused on sport climbing. And I will say, depending on the style of the sport climbing, like in the new, if you just focused on bouldering and then you immediately moved to some sport climbing goals, you probably find that you do really, really well, because this area doesn't really demand for a lot of endurance per se. The style of climbing is naturally bouldery. So in that situation where I don't quite know what the style is like, I would say if you had a really hard bouldering season, say finishing up in March, I'd probably take a couple weeks to deload, just like maybe 1 or 2 weeks off if you feel like you need it, and then start fresh and switch to more of that conjugate style. So where you're focusing on all 3 adaptations. So you want to keep your strength, you want to keep that bouldering power, but you're going to want to start focusing a little bit more on, say, some endurance. So maybe you might strength train once a week, boulder for your power training once a week, and then 1 or 2 days spent on a rope doing some kind of endurance or likely volume training to get your essentially baseline capacity higher for sport routes. I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope it does. Any other questions? Awesome. Okay, I'll let you meditate on that. But let's talk about how you might plan things differently if you have other goals. So for example, say you're a skier, right? Or maybe you are a mountain biker. I don't know. And the short answer would be to basically do a more conjugate style approach with a heavy emphasis on your other sports during different times of the year. So if you do want to still keep some climbing in, which it's totally okay if you don't, I have some athletes who just focus on skiing for a couple months of the year. That's fine. But I would again do a similar thing where, say, maybe you spend the bulk of your time, maybe 2, 3 days skiing or mountain biking, and then your other 2 days focused on probably some strength training to support your other sports, and then some type of climbing, right? So you still want to make sure that you are getting in that climbing stimulus so that when you shift gears to focusing a little bit more on climbing eventually, that it won't have totally fallen off. Um, but again, something has to basically be sacrificed. I think my cat's cat door is frozen and she's trying to get in. But if anybody has any other questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll let you guys loose to go enjoy your Sunday. Okay, we have 2 more questions. Excuse me. Ozzy asks, do you still attempt your project during the off season or early season to see weaknesses? Yes, definitely. The off season, not so much. But early preseason, I will definitely get on a project just so I can kind of like touch base and see what it is exactly that I feel I need to work on. And then from that experience, say you try your project at least 3 times, gather some information, understand what you might need to shift to focus on more, and then work that into your plan. But I think during the off season might be a little bit too early to get on it. You certainly could, but definitely in the preseason. And Mary asks, how would you shift a training plan to accommodate random off-season climbing trips? I guess, example, I live in Maryland, but I want to go to Red Rocks during their on season. I would say if you're planning to perform in Red Rocks, like you want to say send something near or at your limit, then I would just adopt their on season and say that's when you're planning to perform. That's going to be your in season. And then plan back from there. But if you are, say, just going on a climbing trip to have fun, then that's a total different story. You just go out there, have a good time, and then stick with whatever training you're doing during that time. I think taking a week-long trip in the middle of either like an off-season training phase or a preseason training phase, totally acceptable. It's not going to derail whatever training you were already doing. Let me know if that answers your question, Mary. And then John asks, in Philly, we are definitely getting close to an all year round season with climate change. Thank you, climate change. For both bouldering and sport climbing, how would you suggest planning your training if it seems like you don't have an off season? I could totally relate to this. Even in the new, you can definitely climb all year round. And honestly, I still feel guilty a lot of the time because I'm not climbing, even though I know the weather is great. And again, I think that's just one of those sacrifices that you kind of have to make. So knowing that it's not necessarily sustainable for us to perform at our absolute best year round. Now, you can perform all year round, no matter what season, but it's probably not going to be at your highest level of what you're truly capable of doing. So knowing that, I would say pick your battles. So some years, for example, this year, I just did not sport climb this fall. Life was busy and it was easier for me to focus on my bouldering goals. And so I kind of extended my bouldering season to the fall. And I just decided sport climbing wasn't going to happen for me this year. Similarly, though, because I focus on bouldering in 2022, 2023, we're going back to sport climbing goals. So I do think it is really helpful to still plan for an off season, especially if you are like off. By off, I mean rest, and off as in like foundational training time. And just pick and choose. Hopefully that helps, John. Okay, Ozzy says, when you define climbing or bouldering 2 days a week, is this indoors or mostly outdoors or board? So that's just, it doesn't matter. It could be anything. If you have outdoor climbing access, great. If you just climb inside, that's fine too. That example of, say, climbing 2 days a week, strength training 3, or vice versa, was really just to kind of paint a picture of how you would divide up your time. So say 75% of your time, or 3 days a week, would be spent climbing, and then 2 days a week would be spent strength training, 25% of your time. Sometimes I'll program for athletes to strength train and climb in the same session. So no matter how you slice it, you would just divide your time to those percentages. Cool. Anything else? Any other questions? I'll just sit here. If you're like over it, you can leave. We go in the gym at the same distance. And wait if a spotter will come through. Going to Waco if they don't. I usually go to the gym. Yeah, totally. I think that, depending on the time of the year also, and what your goals are, it helps to understand like what you can accomplish in each situation. So, right, for example, right now, it's snowy and really crappy outside, but like last week, it was great. It was prime. And I knew that I could be climbing outside. However, I chose to climb on my moon board instead, because what I was trying to focus on in terms of training was I wanted to get a decent amount of volume in. And I knew that if I was going to go outside, I wasn't going to be able to get as much volume in given my work schedule. And so I chose to stick with the moon board. However, it's because it's the off season. If this was like March or April, closer to that preseason or that in-season time, I definitely would have chosen in favor of outdoor climbing as opposed to going to the gym or my garage. Okay, well, if you guys don't have any other questions, I think I'm going to go ahead and just wrap it up. But if you have anything else that pops up in your brain later, let me know. I am going to upload this recording and send it out so everyone will have access to it. I will also send out a copy of the slides. So if you didn't get a chance to take notes and you want to review those slides, you still can. I will send it out to everyone on my email list. If you have other questions that are, say, a little bit more specific to your situation, feel free to just shoot me an email or a DM on Instagram. And if you really want to dive in, always keep in mind that those coaching intensives are an option as well. So thank you all for being here, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Bye.